Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we'll explore something fundamental to learning, and I know it's something you're really interested in, the role of feedback.
Yeah, it's a rich area, and it's fascinating how much our understanding of feedback has evolved. We've gone beyond just praise and criticism and really delved into its impact on learning, motivation, even self-regulation.
It's true. We've gathered a bunch of sources for this deep dive. Academic studies, pedagogical guides, and even practical insights from university support websites. What connects all these different perspectives?
Well, they all highlight feedback as this driving force in learning, but to really get it, we need to understand what feedback actually is and how it works.
I like that. One of our sources, a paper by Rama Prasad, gives a classic definition. Information about the gap between the actual level and the reference level of a system parameter, which is used to alter the gap in some way. Sounds technical, but how can we break that down?
Imagine you're learning to shoot a basketball. So the reference level is the perfect shot. Swish right through the net every time. The actual level is where your shots are landing now. Feedback tells you about the gap between those two. Maybe you're always shooting too short, or your aim's off to the left.
So it's not just knowing there's a difference, but it's understanding that difference and using it to actually improve.
Exactly. That's the crucial intention to alter the gap part. Good feedback isn't just information, it's information that helps you change your approach and get closer to that target.
I see. That makes me think about times I've gotten feedback that wasn't helpful at all, like just a nice try or you need to work harder. Didn't tell me what to improve or how to do it.
Yeah, those are good examples of a misconception, that any feedback is good. But research tells a different story. Hattie and Timberley, in this huge study of over 6,000 other studies, found that feedback has an average effect size of 0.79 on achievement.
Okay, for our listener who might not be familiar with effect sizes, can you unpack what that 0.79 means?
Sure. Basically, it means that, on average, students who get effective feedback make much more progress than those who don't. To put it another way, that 0.79 effect size is about double the impact of most things we try in education. It's like gaining an extra year's worth of learning.
Wow, that's huge. So it's not about giving any feedback, but giving the right kind of feedback.
Exactly. And that brings us to the different types of feedback and what they're for. Our sources, like the ones from Learning Everest and that text you have there, they distinguish between formative and summative feedback.
This is where it gets really interesting. Let's start with formative feedback. What makes it so powerful?
Think of formative feedback like a GPS, guiding you while you learn. You get it during the learning process, not after it's over. So you can use it to change your course as you go, make corrections, try different things.
So it's like getting directions while you're driving, instead of waiting till you reach your destination to find out you took a wrong turn.
That's a great way to put it. In-class activities, drafts of essays, practice presentations, these are all perfect for formative feedback. It helps students correct their course and get better in a way that just isn't possible with summative feedback.
Which brings us to summative feedback. How does that fit into the picture?
Summative feedback comes at the end of a learning period or a task. It sums up how you did and often goes towards a grade or evaluation. Things like final exams, end-of-term projects, or performance reviews. It's a snapshot of where you are at a certain point.
So formative feedback is about guiding the journey, while summative feedback is about assessing the destination.
Exactly. And both are important for different reasons. Summative feedback helps measure progress, see your strengths, set goals for future learning. But what's interesting is that research shows formative feedback has a much bigger impact on how much you actually learn and improve.
Makes sense. This makes me think of that point from Learning More about feedback needing to be specific, timely, and constructive. Why are those three things so crucial?
Let's start with specific. Vague feedback like good job or needs work doesn't give the learner enough to go on. It's like telling someone to go north without telling them where north is or how far to go.
So instead of good job, you might say, your analysis of the character's motivation was really insightful. You had strong evidence from the text to back up what you were saying.
Exactly. That kind of specific feedback shows the learner what they did well and gives a clear idea of what success looks like. It's actionable, something concrete to build on.
Got it. And what about timely feedback? Why is it so important to get it sooner rather than later?
Well, imagine getting feedback on a presentation weeks after you gave it. The details are blurry, the whole experience feels distant, and you're less likely to use those insights in your next presentation. Timely feedback, though, takes advantage of that immediate learning experience.
Yeah, it's like getting feedback on your tennis serve while you're still on the court. You can adjust right away and see the results.
Exactly. Which leads us to constructive feedback. It's not just pointing out what went wrong, it's about offering ways to improve, focusing on solutions, not just problems.
So instead of your introduction was confusing, we might say, try starting with something that grabs the reader's attention and clearly states your main argument.
Precisely. That's constructive because it gives them a clear way forward. It makes them feel like they can make changes and get better.
All this talk about good feedback makes me wonder, can we teach students how to be better at receiving and using feedback? Seems like they need certain skills to really benefit,
That's where feedback literacy comes in.
and we'll dive into that right after.
Yeah,
So feedback literacy sounds important for getting the most out of feedback.
absolutely. Carlos and Bood, researchers who study educational assessment, they define it as, well, I'll just say it, the understandings, capacities, and dispositions needed to make sense of information and use it to enhance work or learning strategies. It's not just about getting feedback, it's about what you do with it, processing it, using it to get better.
So it's like having a toolbox full of tools, but you got to know how to use them right. Yeah. You might have the best hammer, but if you don't know how to swing it.
Exactly. Perfect analogy. Feedback literacy gives learners the skills to interpret feedback, see what it means for them, and turn that into action. It's about developing like a critical eye for understanding the why behind the feedback and connecting it to their own learning goals.
Makes sense. It reminds me of that student quote from the paper we have. Feedback helps. Immediate feedback allows me to correct my mistakes in my mind right away. It helps me avoid committing my previous mistakes. They're describing that internal feedback loop you mentioned, right?
Great connection. Butler and Wynn, in their research on self-regulated learning, they talk about how our brains are constantly comparing how we're doing to our goals. Creates this internal feedback loop that's super important for self-regulation.
So like a guidance system always running in the background, helping us see our progress and make changes.
Yeah, exactly. And external feedback, the code we get from others, really shapes and refines that internal system. When the feedback is specific, timely, and constructive, it helps calibrate that inner compass, so to speak.
Like a software update for our brains, making our internal feedback system more accurate and effective. I like that.
Me too. And that brings us to the psychological impact of feedback. Learning Mole, in their piece on the power of feedback, they highlight how feedback can really affect self-efficacy and motivation.
For those who might not be familiar, can you quickly explain self-efficacy and motivation and why they're so important for learning?
Sure. Self-efficacy is basically believing you can succeed. It's that I can do this, feeling that fuels your effort and makes you keep going. Motivation is the why behind what we do, what makes us want to engage in something.
So if I have high self-efficacy in, say, math, I'm more likely to think I can solve a tough problem, and I'll be more motivated to put in the work to find the solution.
Exactly. And feedback really shapes those beliefs and motivations. Feedback focused on effort and strategies, not just the end result, can boost a student's sense of self-efficacy.
So instead of, you got an A, you're so smart, it's more like, I was impressed with how you used those strategies we talked about. Your hard work and persistence really paid off.
Perfect example. By focusing on their effort and the strategies they used, you reinforce the idea that they have control over their learning and that success comes from hard work and using good strategies.
But we also have to remember the potential downsides of bad feedback. Hattie and Timperley warn that feedback that's vague, controlling, or has nothing to do with the learning goals can actually hurt their confidence and motivation.
So true. Feedback that feels judgmental, personal, or random can make someone feel helpless and like they can't improve.
Makes me think of times when I got feedback that felt like an attack, not an attempt to help me. It can be really discouraging, especially for learners who are already struggling or unsure of themselves.
Exactly. That's why it's key to approach feedback with sensitivity, empathy, and a clear focus on those learning goals. It should feel like a collaboration, a partnership between the teacher and the learner, where both care about the learner's growth.
You know, it strikes me that feedback shouldn't just be one way, from teacher to student. Peer feedback, where students learn from each other, has a lot of value too, right? Helps develop their critical thinking skills.
Definitely. The research backs that up. The Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning has some great stuff on peer feedback, showing how it benefits both the person giving and receiving it.
What are some of the main advantages of using peer feedback?
Well, for the receiver, peer feedback can give them a fresh perspective on their work. It can also validate their work and make them feel like they belong, especially when they get positive feedback from their classmates.
What about for the giver? What do they get out of giving feedback to their peers?
Giving feedback makes students really analyze their peers' work, pick out the good and the bad, and explain their observations in a clear, constructive way. This process can deepen their own understanding of the material and sharpen their critical thinking skills.
It's like they become the teacher for a minute, right? They have to put themselves in the position of someone who's assessing and evaluating someone else's work.
Exactly. And that's a really valuable experience, both for their learning and personal growth. Helps them develop empathy, better communication skills, and a deeper understanding of how learning works in general.
But we can't just expect students to become expert feedback givers and receivers overnight, right? They need guidance and support to do it well.
You're right, it doesn't just happen magically. Effective peer feedback needs planning, clear guidelines, and time for reflection.
What are some ways teachers can help students give and receive peer feedback more effectively?
One way is to model good feedback, showing them how to give feedback that's specific, constructive, actionable, and focuses on both strengths and areas to improve.
Like showing them a good example before asking them to create their own.
Exactly. And it's not just what to say, but how to say it. Tone of voice, body language, the words you choose all make a big difference in how the feedback comes across.
Another thing I found helpful is giving students clear criteria or rubrics that explain what's expected. This helps everyone understand what good work looks like and makes it easier to give specific and relevant feedback.
That's a good point. Rubrics and examples of good work can be really helpful for scaffolding peer feedback, giving them a framework for analysis and a common language for discussing strengths and weaknesses.
And of course, we can't forget about technology's role in all of this.
That's where it gets really exciting. Technology opens up all these new ways to give and receive feedback, making it more efficient, personalized, and engaging.
Yeah, a ton of potential for sure. Technology can help us with some of the problems with traditional feedback, like not having enough time, all the logistics, and just the sheer amount of feedback teachers have to deal with. It can be overwhelming for sure, that from teacher transmission of information to student feedback literacy paper you have, talks about some tools for different kinds of feedback. Audio, video comments, digital annotations, even online quizzes with automatic feedback. How can these tools make feedback better?
Okay, well, let's take audio-video feedback. Imagine being able to leave a voice or video message for each student, with specific comments on their work, giving encouragement and answering their questions. Adds a human touch that's really effective, especially online or in blended learning.
It's like having a one-on-one with each student, even if you're not in the same room.
Right, and for students who learn best by listening, hearing feedback spoken out loud can be much more powerful than just reading it.
That makes sense. Another tool that paper mentions is digital annotation. What's so good about using digital tools to mark up student work?
Well, digital annotation lets teachers give feedback right on the student's work, highlighting things, adding comments, even drawing diagrams or sketches to get their points across. It's like a shared space where teacher and student can work on the text together.
Oh, I've used digital annotation with my students, and I love how specific I can be with my feedback. I can point to a sentence and say, "This is great imagery," or "Think about revising this for clarity."
Exactly. And students can reply to those comments, ask questions if they need to, and even revise their work right there in the document. Creates this dynamic back and forth that's so much more engaging than just using paper.
I agree. And what about online quizzes with automatic feedback? How can tech help us give instant feedback on what students understand?
Online quizzes are amazing for formative assessment. They let students test themselves, see where they need more practice, and get immediate feedback on their answers.
It's great how some platforms explain why an answer is right or wrong, which helps them really grasp the concepts.
Yeah, for sure. And because it's automated, teachers get more time to give personalized feedback on tougher assignments.
That's a win-win. The GIST guide we have here on assessment and feedback says tech can help with giving personalized feedback, managing teacher workload, and getting data-driven insights into student progress. Can you say more about those?
Of course, personalization is all about making feedback fit each learner's needs. Technology can help us give different kinds of feedback, let students choose how they get it, and even use algorithms to recommend resources or activities based on their strengths and weaknesses.
Like having a virtual assistant who helps us give individual support to every student.
Exactly. And for managing workload, technology can automate those time-consuming tasks like grading quizzes, tracking progress, even creating reports. This gives teachers more time for the more human aspects of feedback, like guiding, encouraging, and supporting students.
So true. And what about data-driven insights? How can tech help us use data to improve our feedback?
A lot of learning platforms collect data on how students are doing, their quiz scores, time spent on tasks, even how they interact with feedback. Teachers can use this data to spot patterns, see trends, and make decisions about how to change their teaching and feedback.
It's like having a dashboard showing you how students are learning in real time, so teachers can make decisions based on data to help students succeed.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about individual students. Data can also help us see bigger trends, like if the whole class is struggling with something, so we can adjust our teaching accordingly.
That's super helpful. Now, switching gears a bit, what about the challenges of feedback in distance learning? That's especially relevant these days. The article by Juris and Alita talks about how isolating it can be and the lack of real-time interaction.
Yeah.
What are some unique challenges to giving good feedback online or in blended learning?
Well, one big one is the lack of face-to-face interaction. It's harder to know if students understand, give instant clarification, and build those personal connections that are so important for feedback to be effective.
It's like trying to give feedback through a one-way mirror. You can see them, but they can't see you, so you don't know if they're getting it.
That's a good way to put it. It shows how important clear communication, clear instructions, and using multiple ways to give feedback are in distance learning. We can't assume students will get what we mean or pick up on those nonverbal cues like they would in person.
Makes sense. So how do we overcome these challenges and give effective feedback online?
One way is to use tech to create chances for interaction and engagement. Video conferencing, online discussions, and collaborative tools can bridge the gap and create that sense of community.
It's about finding ways to recreate those rich, interactive feedback experiences we have in person.
Exactly. And we have to remember that things can get lost in translation online. We need to use clear, simple language, avoid jargon, and be super clear about what we expect.
Right, and we should encourage students to ask questions and get feedback when they need it. We can't assume they'll always feel comfortable reaching out or know how to say what they need.
I agree. We need to create a feedback culture in our online classes where students feel safe asking questions, getting clarification, and sharing their thoughts.
That's so important.
hmm
So as we wrap up this deep dive into feedback, what's the main takeaway?
Feedback is powerful for learning, but how well it works depends on how it's given, received, and used. It's not one size fits all, no magic formula. The best feedback is well-planned, carefully done, and fits the learner's individual needs.
It's about going beyond simple praise or criticism and seeing feedback as this dynamic back and forth that fuels growth and understanding. It's about creating a learning environment where feedback is a gift, a chance to learn and get better, not a judgment or something to be scared of.
That's a great way to put it. As you learn more about this, remember those 3 questions from Hattie and Timperley. Where am I going? How am I going? Where to next? Use those to guide how you give and receive feedback, and you'll be on your way to unlocking its power.
Those are powerful words to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into feedback. We hope you learned something valuable and feel inspired to use feedback to make your own learning or teaching better.
It was great being here. Thanks for having me.
And we'd love to hear from you. What stood out to you the most? How will you use these ideas in your own learning or teaching? Share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep growing.